You've heard the number before. Life expectancy in ancient times, 30 years old. Let that sink in for a second. If that number were literally true, it would mean something almost impossible. No grandparents, no wise elders passing down knowledge by the fire, no one old enough to have lived through a drought, a famine, a hard winter, and remember how the group survived it the last time. Entire generations dying before they could raise their own grandchildren. That's not what happened. And the real explanation for why that number exists at all is stranger and far more revealing than the myth it created. Here's the math nobody walks you through. Imagine 100 ancient infants born in a single year. In many prehistoric populations, roughly 40 of them died before age 5, from disease, infection, or accident, in a world with no antibiotics and no modern medicine. Now average their age at death, 0 to 5 years old, against the ages of everyone else who lived into their 50s, 60s, even 70s. That average collapses toward 30 almost instantly. Not because adults were dying at 30, because catastrophic child mortality was dragging the whole number down with it. Let that land. A statistic describing infancy got mistaken for a statistic describing old age. In 2007, anthropologists Michael Gurven and Hillard Kaplan published a study analyzing life history data across multiple traditional hunter-gatherer populations, including the Hadza of Tanzania and the Ache of Paraguay, groups living without modern medicine in conditions closer to ancient human life than almost anywhere else on Earth. Their finding directly contradicted the 30-year myth. If you survived childhood in these societies, your modal age at death, meaning the single most common age adults actually died at, was somewhere between 68 and 78 years old. Sit with that gap. Not 30, nearly 70. The danger was never adulthood. The danger was surviving to become an adult in the first place. But there's a second layer to this story, one that's even stranger, because it turns out some of the original ancient data itself may have been wrong. In 1982, demographers Jean-Pierre Bouquet-Appel and Claude Massey published a paper that shook the field of paleodemography to its foundation. They examined how archaeologists had been estimating age at death from ancient skeletons, using methods based on things like bone density, tooth wear, and joint degeneration. Their conclusion was blunt. These methods systematically underestimated the ages of older individuals because the skeletal markers researchers relied on for aging essentially plateau after around 50 years old. A skeleton belonging to someone who died at 55 and a skeleton belonging to someone who died at 85 could look nearly identical under these techniques, and researchers, working with imperfect tools, often defaulted to younger estimates. That means an unknown number of ancient elderly people got quietly miscounted as middle-aged for decades, simply because the science of reading old bones wasn't sophisticated enough yet to tell the difference. That's oddly reassuring, if you let it be. The story of universally short ancient lives wasn't just a misreading of statistics, it was partly a limitation of the tools archaeologists were using to study those statistics in the first place. So where does this leave the real picture? In 2004, paleoanthropologists Rachel Kaspari and Sang-Hee Lee published research in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that examined thousands of fossil teeth to estimate the ratio of older adults to younger adults across different periods of human evolution. What they found was a dramatic shift. Starting around 30,000 years ago in the Upper Paleolithic, the number of individuals surviving into what we'd now call grandparent age increased sharply compared to earlier periods of human and pre-human history. Kaspari and Lee connected this directly to something researchers call the grandmother hypothesis. Older individuals who survived past their reproductive years weren't a burden the group merely tolerated. They were an active resource. Grandparents gathered food, cared for grandchildren, and most critically, held on to decades of accumulated knowledge that younger generations hadn't lived long enough to learn yet. Which berries were poisonous, which paths flooded in spring, how the group survived the last famine. A tribe with more elders wasn't a tribe in decline. It was a tribe with a working memory that could outlast any single lifetime. This is where it gets personal. Every piece of survival knowledge your species ever accumulated had to be carried by someone old enough to have lived through it once already and lucky enough to still be alive to pass it on. The elderly weren't rare exceptions in ancient life. They were quite possibly one of the reasons your species made it this far at all. Here's what changes once you understand this. The 30-year-old myth doesn't just misrepresent history, it erases the role your ancestors' grandparents actually played in keeping entire communities alive. It replaces a story about resilience, hard-won survival, and accumulated wisdom with a flattened, misleading number that makes ancient life look shorter and more fragile than it really was for anyone who made it past childhood. You've heard the number before. Life expectancy in ancient times, 30 years old. The next time you hear that statistic repeated as fact, know what it's actually hiding. Not a species that died young. A species where the youngest among them died far too often, so that the ones who survived could grow old enough to remember everything and pass all of it forward. If this video changed how you'll hear that 30 years old stat next time someone repeats it, share it with someone who's never questioned where that number actually comes from, with someone who needs to hear that their grandparents' generation mattered more than history usually gives them credit for. Like this video if it made you rethink a fact you've believed your whole life. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. This channel exists to keep asking the questions nobody else bothers to. And drop a comment below. Who's the oldest person in your life who's taught you something you'd never have learned otherwise? This channel exists because of people who stay till the end. So thank you. Genuinely. See you in the next one.